The muscle violently spasmed, buckling beneath him. Rachel maintained her grip on his collar, using his own collapsing weight against him. As he dropped, she pivoted her hips and drove her forearm down onto the back of his neck, burying his face into the wet asphalt. The entire exchange took less than 2.5 seconds. He hit the ground hard. The sound of his teeth clicking together echoed off the concrete retaining wall. He lay there pinned under the agonizing pressure of Rachel's knee, resting casually between his shoulder blades. He was gasping, a wet, rattling sound, trying to suck in the cold air. The smell of copper blood mixed with the wet pavement. Rachel didn't feel a surge of triumph. There was no righteous vindication. She just felt a profound, heavy disgust. Her knuckles throbbed slightly. The adrenaline was already beginning to curdle in her stomach, making her feel nauseous. "My leg!" the man whimpered, the bass completely gone from his voice. It was the voice of a panicked child. "I can't feel my leg." Rachel kept her weight steady. She leaned down, her mouth inches from his ear. "You're experiencing a severe contusion to the sciatic nerve," she said, her tone conversational, clinical. "It will feel like it's on fire for the next 3 days. Your jaw is likely fractured. Do not try to stand up." He groaned, spitting blood and saliva onto the asphalt. The bravado had evaporated, replaced by genuine, unadulterated terror. He didn't understand what had just happened. The math in his head, his size, his belt, his gym, didn't add up to his face scraping against oil-stained gravel. Rachel looked up. The two friends were still standing by the diner door, frozen like deer in headlights. They made no move to intervene. Slowly, Rachel stood up. She wiped a speck of blood off her jacket sleeve. She looked down at the man groveling at her boots. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. "Last warning." She turned and walked the remaining 30 yards to her truck. She unlocked the door, climbed inside, and locked it behind her. She sat in the dark cab for a long time, listening to the rain tap against the windshield, waiting for her hands to stop shaking before she put the key in the ignition. The truck's heater smelled like burning dust and old dog hair, coughing lukewarm air against Rachel's damp face. She sat with the engine idling, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles had turned a bloodless white. The wiper blades scraped back and forth across the glass, squeaking violently every time they hit a dry patch. She didn't put the truck in gear. Not yet. She couldn't. Violence is a high-interest loan, and biology always comes to collect. During the brief 2-second altercation, her sympathetic nervous system had flooded her body with cortisol and epinephrine. It had dilated her pupils, shunted blood away from her digestive tract, and turned her muscles into high-tension steel cables. Now the threat was gone, and the withdrawal was brutal. Her hands began to shake. First, just a fine tremor in her fingers, then a deep structural shudder that traveled up her forearms and into her chest. Her teeth chattered, clicking together audibly over the rumble of the engine. She leaned her forehead against the cold, hard plastic of the steering wheel and closed her eyes. She didn't feel like a victor. She felt like a stray dog that had been backed into a corner over a scrap of garbage. "I should have just kept walking," she thought. The familiar cycle of regret taking hold. I should have let him throw the punch, let it glance off, take the hit, walk away. But she knew that was a lie. You don't let a man with that much unchecked aggression land a free hit. You don't know if he has a weapon, or friends willing to jump in, or if that one punch happens to catch the temple and turn out the lights permanently. Her training wasn't a switch she could toggle off. It was an operating system wired into her brainstem. Threat recognized, threat eliminated, minimum movement, maximum output. She took a slow, jagged breath, tasting the stale diner coffee lingering in the back of her throat. When the shaking finally subsided to a manageable twitch, she dropped the truck into drive and pulled out of the lot. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. The drive home was a blur of blinking yellow traffic lights and empty, rain-slicked intersections. Her apartment was on the second floor of a tired brick building on the edge of the industrial district. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business because getting involved usually cost money or blood. She parked, climbed the rusted iron stairs, and unlocked her door. The deadbolt engaged behind her with a heavy, satisfying thunk. The apartment was sparse. A gray sofa, a small television she rarely turned on, and a bookshelf packed with dog-eared paperbacks and heavy, dense volumes on human anatomy and kinesiology. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and old drywall. It was cold, but she didn't touch the thermostat. Rachel walked straight to the kitchen sink and turned on the cold water. She scrubbed her hands with cheap dish soap, watching the suds spiral down the drain. Her right hand was stiff. The base of her palm, where it had connected with the man's jaw, was flushed a dark, angry pink. By tomorrow, it would be a bruised, mottled purple. She dried her hands on a paper towel and walked into the bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered, casting a sickly green pallor over the mirror. She stared at her reflection. She looked exactly how she felt, exhausted, hollowed out, carrying a weight that nobody else in the room could see. Her eyes, pale and flat, stared back without offering any comfort. She stripped off her damp clothes, letting them fall to the linoleum floor. Her body was a map of old violence. A thick, raised keloid scar ran across her left ribs. Small, circular puncture marks dotted her left shoulder. She didn't look at them. They were just topography. She stood under the shower, turning the dial until the water was scalding hot. She let it beat against her back, trying to melt the lingering ice of the adrenaline crash. But the hot water only seemed to warm her skin. Her core remained cold, locked in that empty parking lot. Eventually, the water ran lukewarm, then cold. Rachel stepped out, toweled off, and put on a pair of heavy sweatpants. She lay down on her bed, staring at the shadows cast by the street lamp through her cheap blinds. The silence of the apartment was oppressive. When you live your life at 100 miles an hour, navigating life or death variables, the complete absence of stimuli feels less like peace and more like sensory deprivation. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the wet, sickening crack of the man's jaw. She felt the heavy, collapsing weight of him under her knee. She remembered the sound of his voice breaking, transforming from arrogant predator to terrified prey in the span of a single heartbeat. She hadn't taught him a lesson. He wouldn't wake up tomorrow a better person. He would wake up in agonizing pain, humiliated, and he would likely take that anger out on someone smaller, someone who didn't know how to pivot off the center line. Violence never really solved the root of the problem. It just transferred the trauma from one vessel to another. Rachel rolled onto her side, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin. She lay awake for 3 more hours, listening to the distant wail of a police siren fading into the rain, waiting for the sun to rise and wash the night away. Morning came without grace. It didn't break. It merely seeped through the cracks in the blinds, a gray, flat light that made everything look covered in a fine layer of dust. Rachel woke up with a dry mouth and a dull, pulsing ache at the base of her skull. She sat up, the joints in her lower back popping in a staccato rhythm. She looked at her right hand. The heel of her palm was swollen, a deep, ugly bruise blooming under the skin like spilled ink. She flexed her fingers. They were stiff, the tendons protesting the movement. It wasn't broken, but it was going to make her day difficult. 45 minutes later, she pulled her truck into the gravel lot of Finch & Sons Custom Carpentry. It was a small operation housed in a cavernous, corrugated steel building that smelled beautifully of pine sap, sawdust, and hot engine oil. This was Rachel's sanctuary. Here, the rules of the world made sense. Measure twice, cut once. Wood didn't have an ego. Wood didn't try to prove its dominance. If you applied the right pressure with the right tool, it yielded perfectly. If you rushed it, it splintered. There was an honesty to carpentry that human beings completely lacked. She walked through the rolling bay doors. The air compressors were already humming. "Morning, Rach." Arthur Finch, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of an old oak stump, looked up from a massive planer. He was in his late 60s, missing half of his left index finger, and possessed a quiet, steady demeanor that Rachel deeply respected. He didn't ask questions about her past. He just cared that her cuts were square, and she showed up on time. "Morning, Arthur," Rachel said, her voice raspy. She walked over to her workbench. A partially assembled cherrywood dining table sat in the center of her space. It was a beautiful piece, the grain rich and swirling. She ran her left hand over the unsanded surface. The texture was rough, raw, holding immense potential. She reached for her orbital sander with her right hand. As her palm pressed against the hard plastic grip, a sharp spike of pain shot up her forearm. She hissed through her teeth, her grip faltering. The sander clattered onto the workbench. Arthur paused the planer. The sudden silence in the shop was heavy. He wiped his hands on his canvas apron and walked over to her bench. Adrenaline finally overrode Trent's remaining common sense. He pulled his right arm all the way back, his shoulder rotating clumsily, dropping his guard entirely. It was a wide looping haymaker, thrown with maximum malice and zero technical proficiency. To a panicked civilian, a punch like that looked like sudden, inescapable violence. To David, it looked like a problem moving in slow motion. Physics is an unforgiving teacher. Trent had committed all his body weight to a forward trajectory, relying on the impact to stop his momentum. David simply removed the target. He did not step back. Stepping back gave an aggressor room to recalibrate. Instead, David stepped inside the wide arc of the fist, closing the distance to 6 inches. His movement was utterly devoid of aggression. It was a cold, calculated geometric shift. As Trent's heavy fist sailed harmlessly through the empty air over David's left shoulder, David brought his own left forearm up. He didn't punch. He delivered a short, sharp, perfectly angled chop to the inside of Trent's extended bicep, striking directly over the brachial plexus nerve cluster. It wasn't a movie strike designed to look impressive. It was an anatomical off-switch. Trent let out a strangled, breathless gasp as a jagged spike of electricity shot from his armpit down to his fingertips. His right arm instantly went dead, dropping to his side like a heavy, useless piece of wet meat. His brain sent frantic signals to his fingers to clench, to grab, to strike again, but the neural pathway was completely jammed. Before Trent could even process the sudden paralysis of his dominant limb, David's right hand moved. He casually grabbed a handful of Trent's heavy branded jacket right at the center of his chest. David twisted his wrist, balling the fabric tight, establishing absolute control over the younger man's center of gravity. Trent's forward momentum was already working against him. David merely provided a slight downward pull, while simultaneously hooking his right boot behind Trent's left ankle. It was a standard-issue tactical sweep executed with the bored precision of a man performing a maintenance check on a rifle. Trent went completely airborne for a fraction of a second. The ceiling lights spun wildly in his vision. Then, gravity asserted itself. Trent hit the linoleum floor flat on his back. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp, pathetic wheeze. His skull bounced lightly against the grout. Before Trent could instinctively thrash or roll, David was already there. David dropped his left knee squarely onto Trent's sternum, pinning him to the floor with 200 pounds of unrelenting, focused pressure. David's right hand slid down Trent's paralyzed arm, grabbing the wrist and locking the elbow against David's own hip. The angle was absolute. One hard twist, and Trent's shoulder would dislocate. 2 twists, and the joint would shatter entirely. Absolute, profound silence blanketed O'Malley's bar and grill. The ambient clatter of plates and silverware ceased. The low hum of conversations died in the throats of 50 patrons. The only sound left in the room was the heavy rhythmic drumming of the rain against the front windows and Trent's frantic, ragged attempts to suck oxygen back into his flattened lungs. David looked down at the man pinned beneath him. David's breathing had not elevated. He hadn't broken a sweat. His face remained a mask of profound, weary indifference. He wasn't looking at a human being anymore. He was looking at a neutralized variable. In the booth, Trent's 3 friends finally shook off their paralysis. The largest of the trio, a guy in a gray hoodie, started to slide out from behind the table, his face flushing red. "Hey man, let him go." David shifted his eyes from Trent to the guy in the hoodie. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice over the steady hum of the rain. He just looked at him. The eyes of a man who had called in airstrikes on fortified compounds, who had watched men tear each other apart in the dirt. It was a look completely devoid of empathy, warmth, or hesitation. It was a promise of immediate, catastrophic violence. "Sit down," David said. 2 words, flat and dead. The guy in the hoodie froze, 1 foot hovering over the spilled beer. His brain, deeply attuned to primal survival instincts, registered the threat level radiating from the kneeling waiter. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't an ego clash. This was a predator giving a warning. The guy swallowed hard, slowly pulled his foot back, and slid wordlessly back into the booth, pressing himself against the vinyl upholstery. His 2 friends shrank down beside him, staring at their hands. David returned his attention to Trent. Trent's face was pale, slick with cold sweat. The sneering, arrogant black belt had entirely evaporated, replaced by a terrified kid who suddenly realized he had kicked a sleeping wolf. His eyes were wide, darting from David's face to the knee crushing his chest. "I'm going to remove my knee," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble meant only for Trent. "You're going to stand up. You're not going to speak. You're going to leave a $50 bill on the table for the young lady you disrespected. Then you and your friends are going to walk out that door. If you attempt to escalate, I will break this arm in 3 places before you hit the ground. Do you understand?" Trent couldn't speak. The pressure on his chest was too immense. He managed a frantic, trembling nod, his eyes pleading. David held the lock for exactly 3 more seconds. Time dilates in moments of absolute panic, and David knew those 3 seconds would feel like 3 hours to the kid pinned beneath his knee. He wanted the reality of the situation to burn itself permanently into the younger man's neural pathways. He wanted Trent to remember the absolute, suffocating helplessness, the cold, brutal realization that gym mats and colored belts meant absolutely nothing against genuine applied lethality. Smoothly, methodically, David stood up. He didn't shove Trent away or throw a final performative glare. He simply released the wrist, stepped back, and let his hands drop loosely to his sides, instantly returning to a neutral, relaxed stance. To any uninitiated observer walking in at that exact second, he looked like a mild-mannered, middle-aged waiter, patiently waiting for a customer to finish signing a credit card receipt. Trent scrambled backward across the slick, beer-soaked linoleum. His heavy combat boots frantically sought purchase, squeaking uselessly against the wet grout. He managed to drag himself upright, heavily favoring his right side. His paralyzed arm still hung completely useless, a dead pendulum swinging from his shoulder. He didn't look at David. He didn't look at the large, silent audience of diners watching him. His chest heaved as he dug his functioning left hand deep into his jeans pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, his fingers trembling violently, and tossed it onto the dark wood of the table. "Let's go," Trent mumbled, his voice thick, choked with spit and absolute humiliation. His three friends didn't need to be told twice. The bravado had been sucked completely out of the room. They scrambled out of the booth, their heads ducked low to their chests, completely ignoring the broken glass and the pool of dark stout. The four men hurried down the center aisle. They didn't swagger. They practically shoved each other out of the way to reach the heavy glass door, pushing out into the freezing, relentless rain and disappearing into the black city night. Quiet hung in the dining room for 5 long seconds. Then the bell above the door chimed softly, breaking the vacuum. A collective staggered exhale swept through O'Malley's. Slowly, hesitantly, the clatter of silverware against porcelain resumed. Conversations restarted in hushed, nervous whispers. David knelt back down. He picked up the plastic dustpan and the small broom, and resumed sweeping the jagged shards of the pint glass.